The morning arrived softly, wrapped in pale sunlight and the faint hum of distant traffic. He stood by the kitchen window, coffee mug warm between his hands, gazing out at the quiet street beyond his porch. It was the kind of morning where nothing felt urgent, where time seemed to stretch just a little longer before the day truly began. Then he saw her. A calico cat moved carefully across the worn wooden planks of his porch, her coat a patchwork of orange, black, and white that caught the early light. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped him mid-sip. It was what she carried. Gently clamped between her jaws was a tiny kitten, no bigger than his palm, its eyes still sealed shut, its body limp with trust or exhaustion. She moved with deliberate slowness, each step measured, as though the weight she bore was more precious than her own life. She reached the corner near his front door and lowered her head. With infinite care, she placed the kitten down on the weathered mat, adjusting it once with her nose to make sure it was safe. Then she lifted her gaze. Through the glass, their eyes met. Hers were green and gold, tired but resolute, framed by a face that looked too thin, too worn. She held his stare for a long, unblinking moment, not in fear, not in challenge, but in something that felt almost like a question, or perhaps a plea that he didn't move. He wasn't sure he could. There was something profound in that gaze, something that reached past the barrier of species and spoke directly to the part of him that understood vulnerability. Before he could step toward the door, she turned and vanished into the overgrown bushes at the edge of his yard, her form swallowed by shadow and green. The kitten remained. It shifted slightly, tiny paws twitching in sleep. He set down his mug and moved to the door, opening it carefully. The cool air rushed in as he crouched down, studying the fragile creature before him. It was real. This was happening. A stray cat had just entrusted him with her baby. He knelt there, confused and deeply concerned, as the weight of that silent exchange settled into his chest. He didn't yet understand what it meant, but something told him this was only the beginning. He had brought the first kitten inside, nestling it in a lined shoebox near the radiator, unsure what else to do. The tiny creature slept soundly, its breathing barely visible beneath its soft fur. He checked on it every few minutes, torn between calling animal control and waiting to see if the mother would return. The decision was made for him when he glanced out the window and saw her again. She emerged from the same line of bushes, moving with that same deliberate carefulness, another kitten held securely in her mouth. This one was smaller than the first, its coat a muted tabby pattern, and it mewed softly as she carried it across the porch. The sound was fragile and insistent, a tiny voice calling out to siblings it couldn't yet see. She placed it in the exact spot where the first had been, nosing it gently until it settled. Then she looked up at the window once more. He stepped outside this time, slowly, his hands open and non-threatening. She didn't flee. Instead, she backed away a few careful paces, watching him with those same amber-green eyes, her body tense but not panicked. He knelt beside the second kitten, its small mouth opening and closing as it searched for warmth. When he looked back toward the bushes, she was already retreating, slipping into the shadows like smoke. The realization hit him then, quiet and certain. She wasn't abandoning them. She was bringing them to him. One by one, she was entrusting her entire litter to a stranger because somehow, in her desperate calculation, he was the safest option she had. The thought lodged itself deep in his chest. Heavy and humbling, he carried the second kitten inside and placed it beside its sibling. Then he returned to the porch with a shallow dish of water and a small plate of tuna from his pantry. He set them down near the spot where she'd been standing, hoping she'd return to eat, to rest, to know she was welcome too. The food sat untouched for now, but he didn't move it. He simply sat on the step, the afternoon sun warming his shoulders, and waited. His heart stirred with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, not quite responsibility, but something in between. A quiet sense that he'd been chosen for something important, and that walking away was no longer an option. The sky had darkened by the time she returned, clouds gathering overhead in thick, slate-colored layers. A light rain had begun to fall, tapping softly against the roof and pooling in the shallow grooves of the porch steps. He'd been watching through the window, checking every few minutes, and when he saw her emerge from the bushes again, his chest tightened. She moved slower this time, her steps heavier, and the kitten in her mouth was damp, its fur darkened by the rain. She set it down beside the shallow dish of water he'd left out. And for the first time, she didn't immediately retreat. She stood there, sides heaving with each breath, her ribs visible beneath her patchy coat. The rain had soaked through to her skin, and she looked smaller than before, fragile in a way that made him ache. Her breathing was labored, each inhale a visible effort. And he realized just how much this journey was costing her. He stepped outside carefully, an old towel draped over his arm and a flattened cardboard box in his other hand. She watched him but didn't move, too tired to run, too desperate to care. He knelt a few feet away and began assembling a makeshift shelter against the wall of the house, tucking the cardboard at an angle to shield it from the rain. Then he spread the towel inside, smoothing it flat, and gently lifted the damp kitten, wrapping it in a corner of the fabric. Its tiny body shivered against his palm that he set the wrapped kitten down inside the shelter, then slowly backed away. The mother cat stepped forward, cautious but drawn by instinct. She sniffed the towel, then the kitten, before carefully settling herself at the edge of the cardboard, just far enough to watch both her baby and him. Her breathing was still rough, but she lowered her head slightly, her eyes half closing in what might have been exhaustion or the beginning of trust. He sat down on the step, rain dampening his shirt, and met her gaze. Something passed between them in that moment, subtle but undeniable. She was letting him help. She was letting him in. He stayed there as the rain continued to fall, unwilling to leave her alone in the cold. Feeling the quiet weight of responsibility settling deeper into his bones, he woke before sunrise, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, having fallen asleep on the couch near the window where he could watch the porch. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of rain that had continued through the night. He stood and moved to the window, peering out into the dim pre-dawn light, and his breath caught 5 kittens now huddled together beneath the cardboard shelter. A small tangle of fur and warmth pressed close against the cold. 2 new arrivals had been added sometime in the dark hours while he slept, and the sight of them stirred something deep and aching in his chest. The mother cat lay a few feet away on the damp porch, her body curled into itself, her eyes half open and fixed on the shelter. She looked utterly spent, her breathing shallow, her fur matted and rain-soaked. He grabbed a fleece blanket from the back of the couch and stepped outside as quietly as he could. The cool morning air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. He approached slowly, keeping his movements gentle and predictable. The mother cat's ears flicked toward him, but she didn't rise, didn't retreat. She simply watched as he knelt beside the cardboard box and carefully draped the blanket over the top, creating a warmer canopy for the kittens below. They shifted slightly in their sleep, tiny paws kneading at each other, their mouths opening in silent mews. He sat back on his heels and looked at the mother. Her gaze never left him, but there was no fear in it now. Only exhaustion and something else, something that felt almost like gratitude. She had crossed invisible boundaries in the night, traveled unknown distances, risked everything to bring her babies here. To him, a stranger, someone she had chosen based on nothing more than a feeling, a desperate instinct that told her he might be safe. The weight of that faith settled heavily on his shoulders. She had given him her trust in the most profound way she knew how, and now 5 fragile lives depended on whether she had been right. He stayed there as the sky began to lighten, the rain easing to a drizzle, and made a silent promise to the tired calico watching him. He wouldn't let her down. The morning stretched into afternoon, and she didn't come back. He sat on the porch step, coffee growing cold in his hand, eyes scanning the bushes and the street beyond for any sign of movement. The 5 kittens had begun to stir, their small voices rising in thin, plaintive cries that cut through the quiet. They were hungry, confused, instinctively sensing that something wasn't right. Their mother should have been there, curled around them, her warmth and presence the only world they'd ever known. That he couldn't wait any longer. He went inside and returned with a bottle of kitten formula he'd picked up from the corner store earlier that morning, along with a small dropper. Kneeling beside the cardboard shelter, he carefully lifted one of the kittens, its body impossibly light, in his palm. It squirmed weakly, mouth opening and closing in search of milk. He filled the dropper and touched it gently to the kitten's lips. After a moment of resistance, it latched on, sucking with desperate urgency. One by one. He fed them all, speaking softly as he worked, his voice low and steady in the stillness. He told them they were safe, that he was here, even though he wasn't sure they could understand. Maybe it was more for himself than for them. The rhythm of it calmed him, the careful measuring, the patient waiting as each tiny mouth took what it needed. But beneath the quiet routine, worry gnawed at him. Where was she? Why hadn't she returned? He thought of her tired eyes, her labored breathing, the way her ribs had shone through her damp fur. She had been running on nothing but willpower and maternal instinct, pushing her body past its limits. And now she was out there somewhere, alone, possibly hurt or too weak to make the journey back. The thought made his chest tighten as the afternoon light softened into early evening. He settled the kittens back into their shelter, tucking the blanket around them. They quieted, their bellies full, their small bodies relaxing into sleep. He stayed close, watching over them the way she would have, feeling the weight of her absence like a physical thing. In her silence, the bond between them had deepened. He was no longer just a bystander. He was all they had, and he would not abandon them. The night had settled in fully, the street lamps casting pale yellow pools of light across the empty road. He sat on the porch in the dark, wrapped in a jacket against the chill, unwilling to go inside. The kittens slept soundly in their shelter, their soft breathing the only sound in the stillness. He'd almost convinced himself she wasn't coming back when he saw her. She emerged from the shadows at the edge of the yard, moving so slowly he almost didn't recognize her at first. Her legs trembled with each step, her body swaying slightly, as though the effort of staying upright was almost too much. In her mouth, held with the same gentle care as all the others, was a sixth kitten. This one was smaller than the rest, its body limp and still, and his heart lurched at the sight. She made it to the porch, each step a monumental act of will, and lowered her head with painstaking slowness. She set the kitten down beside the shelter, nosing it once, twice, as if making sure it was real, that she had truly made it. Then her legs gave out. She didn't collapse violently, but rather seemed to melt into the wooden planks. Her body settling with a soft exhale that sounded like surrendered, he was beside her in an instant. Kneeling close, his hands hovering uncertainly over her frail form. She was shaking, her sides heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Her fur was damp with sweat and dew, her eyes glassy and unfocused. He could see every bone in her spine, every rib pressing against her skin. She had given everything she had to bring this last baby home. He reached out slowly and rested his hand gently on her side, feeling the wild flutter of her heartbeat beneath his palm. She didn't flinch. She didn't have the strength left to fear him. Her eyes shifted toward the shelter where all 6 of her kittens now lay, and something in her expression softened, a quiet relief washing over her exhausted face. He understood then what this journey had cost her. She had walked to the edge of her own survival to make sure they were all safe, that not one was left behind. He sat there in the dark, his hand still resting on her trembling body, and felt tears sting his eyes. She had trusted him with everything. And now it was his turn to prove she hadn't been wronged. He turned his attention to the 6th kitten, and his stomach dropped. It lay motionless on the porch, its tiny body cold to the touch, its chest barely moving. He could see no rise and fall of breath, no flicker of life in its stillness. His hands began to shake as he lifted it carefully, cradling it in his palms. It was so small, smaller than any of the others, its fur still damp and matted. He didn't know if he was already too late. Without thinking, he pressed the kitten gently against his chest, tucking it beneath his jacket where his body heat could reach it. He began to rub its back in slow, careful circles, applying just enough pressure to stimulate circulation without hurting its fragile frame. His breath came quick and shallow, his heart hammering as he willed the tiny creature to respond. The seconds stretched unbearably long, each one heavy with silence and fear. The mother cat lay nearby, her head resting on the porch, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that pierced straight through. She was too weak to move, too exhausted to do anything but watch. But her gaze held everything: trust, desperation, a mother's helpless hope that the stranger she'd chosen could do what she no longer had the strength to do herself. But he kept rubbing, kept whispering soft, desperate encouragements under his breath. And then, so faint he almost missed it, the kitten twitched. A tiny shudder ran through its body. Its mouth opened slightly, and a small, rasping breath escaped. Then another. Its paws flexed weakly against his chest, and warmth began to seep back into its cold limbs. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, tears welling in his eyes and spilling over before he could stop them. Relief flooded through him, overwhelming and raw, and he pressed his forehead gently against the top of the kitten's head, feeling its heartbeat strengthen beneath his hand. It was alive. It was going to be okay. He looked over at the mother cat, still watching him with those tired, knowing eyes. She blinked once, slowly, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not quite peace, but close. She had done everything she could. And now, so had he. They had saved this fragile life together. And in that shared moment, everything between them changed. That he made the decision without hesitation. The porch was no place for them. Not anymore. Carefully, he gathered the kittens one by one, placing them in a deep wicker basket lined with soft towels. They mewed quietly, stirring at the movement but settling quickly into the warmth. The mother cat watched every motion, her eyes following his hands, but she didn't protest. She didn't have the strength to resist, even if she'd wanted to. When all 6 kittens were secure, he turned to her. She was still lying on the porch, trembling slightly, her body too exhausted to stand. He slid his hands beneath her gently, lifting her with the same care he'd used for her babies. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless, her frail body folding into his arms without struggle. He carried her inside, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his chest, and settled her carefully beside the basket in the corner of his living room. He'd prepared the space while waiting for her return earlier that evening. Clean blankets were layered into a nest, a small lamp nearby cast a warm, gentle glow, and a shallow dish of water sat within easy reach. He placed her down on the softest part of the bedding, and she immediately turned toward her kittens, nosing each one as if counting them, making sure they were all there. One by one, the kittens found their way to her, instinct guiding them even in their blindness. They latched on and began to nurse, their tiny paws kneading rhythmically against her belly. Her breathing, which had been so labored and uneven, began to slow and deepen. The tension in her body eased as her babies fed, the sound of their soft suckling filling the quiet room. That he sat down on the floor a few feet away, his back against the couch, and watched them in the low light. The mother cat's eyes drifted closed, her head resting on the blanket, finally allowing herself to let go. She had carried them all to safety. She had done the impossible. And now, in this warm corner of a stranger's home, she could rest. He stayed there through the night, checking on them every hour, adjusting blankets, refilling water. He was no longer a stranger to her. He was the one she had chosen, the guardian she had entrusted with everything that mattered. And he would honor that trust with every breath. The days unfolded gently, marked by small victories and quiet transformations. The kittens grew stronger with each passing morning, their bodies filling out, their movements becoming more coordinated. Their eyes began to open, tiny slits at first, then wider, revealing curious gazes that tracked movement and light. They tumbled over each other in clumsy play, their mews growing louder and more insistent as their personalities began to emerge. The mother cat recovered slowly but steadily. Her breathing returned to normal, her ribs less prominent as she ate regular meals and rested without fear. He brought her soft food and fresh water twice a day, sitting nearby while she ate, giving her space but staying close enough that she knew she wasn't alone. And then one morning, as he entered the room with her breakfast, he heard it. A soft rumbling sound, low and rhythmic. She was purring. He stopped in his tracks, a smile spreading across his face. She watched him from her nest of blankets, her eyes half closed in contentment, and the purr grew louder as he approached. He set the food down and knelt beside her, reaching out slowly. She leaned into his hand, pressing her head against his palm, and the purr vibrated through his fingers. It was trust made audible, gratitude expressed in the only language she had. He named her Grace that day. It felt right, a name that honored everything she had endured and overcome. She had carried her family through impossible odds with nothing but determination and faith, and she had survived. Grace suited her. The smallest kitten, the one he had warmed against his chest that terrible night, turned out to be the most spirited of them all. Once strong enough to move freely, it became the ringleader of the tiny group, pouncing on siblings, batting at shadows, exploring every corner of the room with fearless curiosity. He watched it tumble and play, remembering how still and cold it had been in his hands, and felt his chest swell with something close to pride. Hope had replaced fear in that small, warm corner of his home. What had begun as an act of desperate trust had become something more, something deeper. Grace rested peacefully among her thriving kittens, and he sat nearby, no longer wondering what would happen next. They were home. They were safe. And they were his. He had thought about finding them homes, reaching out to shelters or friends who might want a kitten. But every time he considered it, something in his chest tightened, a resistance he couldn't ignore. These weren't just animals he'd helped. They were family now, bound together by something deeper than circumstance. So he made the decision that had been forming quietly in his heart for days. He would keep them all. The porch where it had all begun was empty now, the cardboard shelter dismantled, the rain-soaked towels washed and folded away. It felt like a lifetime ago, though only weeks had passed. That quiet morning when a desperate mother had appeared with her first kitten seemed like a memory from another world. A turning point he hadn't recognized until he was already standing on the other side of it. Grace lay curled beside him on the couch now, her body relaxed and warm against his leg. She purred softly, her eyes half closed in contentment, occasionally lifting her head to watch her kittens as they played. They tumbled across the living room floor in a chaotic tangle of fur and energy, pouncing on toy mice, wrestling with each other, their tiny voices filling the space with life. The smallest one, the fighter, climbed onto the armrest and batted at his hand. Fearless and full of mischief, he reached down and stroked Grace's head, feeling the softness of her fur, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. She looked up at him with those amber-green eyes that had first held his gaze through the window, and he saw peace there now. No more fear, no more desperation, just quiet trust and the kind of bond that didn't need words. He thought about how fragile trust was, how profound. She had placed her entire world into the hands of a stranger because she had no other choice, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked. In saving her and her kittens, he had saved something in himself too. The loneliness that had quietly filled his home for so long had been replaced by purpose, by connection, by the beautiful chaos of 7 lives intertwined with his own. One quiet morning had changed everything. A stray calico cat had chosen him, and in doing so, had given him more than he'd ever thought to ask for. He sat there as the afternoon light streamed through the windows, surrounded by the family he never knew he needed, and felt truly, deeply home.